You've seen too much, human. We must bond now, before my brothers kill you, the alien girl said. Rowan Velasquez knelt on a smooth ledge of wet stone, the steam rising around him in delicate swirls that smelled faintly of minerals and warm earth. The faint hiss of thermal vents whispered in the background, punctuated by the rhythmic drip of water from stalactites overhead. He ran his hand along the ground, feeling for subtle vibrations. There was a gentle thrum beneath his palm, like a distant heartbeat of the planet itself, or perhaps an echo of the hot springs. He glanced down at the reflection of his face in the gently rippling water, a rugged visage, with a short beard outlining a determined jaw and hair that curled against his scalp in thick dark locks. His eyes, a hazel hue that shifted toward green in the ambient light, looked back at him, and he couldn't shake the lingering guilt that always haunted their depths. He exhaled slowly, the warm air soothing the tension in his muscles. Every nerve in his body still felt alert, a reflex from the years he'd spent on remote assignments, charting unknown territories. This place was supposed to be a routine scouting mission, confirm whether the valley's geothermal activity was safe enough for the off-world colonists. But something about these springs had drawn him in deeper. They were hidden behind towering limestone formations that looked more like ancient spires than rocks. Rowan had climbed over the ridges, ignoring the faint alarm in his mind that told him he was going beyond the bounds of the official survey. He'd been compelled to see more, to test the water, to let curiosity guide him instead of caution. It was a risky move, especially given the tragedy he'd once caused by straying from protocol. He touched a thin scar at his left brow, remembering the moment it was cut open in a scramble for survival a few years back. He'd lost a crewmate that day, and though the blame had never been placed squarely on him, he'd carried the responsibility all the same. That memory lived behind his eyes, fueling both his desire to do his job well and a gnawing fear that he'd lead someone else to a similar fate. The water lapped gently against the ledge. He dipped his fingers into the pool, letting the warmth seep into his bones. Then he noticed a subtle disturbance in the water's surface, a ripple that wasn't caused by his hand. A moment later, he froze at the sound of movement. It was the soft shift of water parting around a form. Someone or something was in there with him. Rowan rose, bracing himself. The steam parted like a curtain, and he found himself staring at a figure only a few feet away in the pool. She stood, half submerged, water beading on her pale alabaster skin that seemed to shimmer like polished marble under the torchlight glow of the thermal vents. Her hair was a sleek black, cascading around her shoulders with faint hints of violet in the strands that caught the light. Most striking of all were her elongated ears, pointed at the tips, and her large, opalescent eyes, which reflected a soft grey hue shot through with hints of silver and blue. She looked almost too ethereal to be real, as though she'd stepped out of some ancient legend. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rowan's heart thudded against his chest. He saw the tension in her slender arms, the subtle shift of her shoulders. Her gaze flicked over him, taking in every detail, from his damp clothes to the utility belt at his waist. The water lapped around her collarbones, revealing delicate patterns that traced over her skin like frost veins. He wasn't sure if they were natural markings or tattoos, but they pulsed faintly, as though carrying a quiet luminescence beneath the surface. She spoke in a language he didn't recognize, her voice echoing softly off the stone walls. When he didn't respond, her expression darkened, and she tried again in a more measured tone. At first he couldn't make out the words. Then, with an urgency that made his blood run cold, she exclaimed in halting but clear speech, "You've seen too much, human. We must bond now, before my brothers kill you." Her words shot through him like a bolt of lightning. "Bond? Brothers kill you?" Rowan raised his hands in a placating gesture, heart pounding. "Wait," he said, his voice hushed. "I don't understand. I'm not here to harm anyone. I'm just surveying." She moved closer in a single graceful surge, water streaming off her skin. He realized that beneath the ethereal beauty there was coiled strength. He took a half-step back, torn between wariness and awe. The woman's ears twitched slightly, as though picking up distant sounds. Then she turned those luminous eyes back on him. "You cannot be allowed to leave," she whispered as though delivering a sentence. "If you do, you endanger everything we have kept hidden." Rowan swallowed. He could see the conflict in her face, a flicker of regret, or perhaps desperation. "I'm not looking to expose anything," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could. "I'm just a surveyor. My name is Rowan Velasquez." She didn't seem impressed by his credentials. Her lips parted, and he saw that her teeth were slightly sharper than a human's, though not enough to be grotesque, just another subtle sign that she was something else entirely. "I am called Aelynn'rae," she said, each syllable flowing in a delicate cadence. "You have already violated our sanctum, Rowan Velasquez. By law, you must be silenced." Her eyes narrowed. "But there is a rite. If we bond, you may be accepted into our kin, and my brothers will have no right to kill you." Rowan felt a jolt at the thought of forced union, but something about the desperation in her voice made him pause. She didn't seem like she wanted to kill him. "I don't know what that means," he managed. "But if it saves my life, I'm listening." She let out a breath that caused her shoulders to tremble, a subtle sign of her tension. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said. "You come from beyond, from a place my people have always feared, but I cannot let them harm you." She closed her eyes briefly, and in that moment Rowan glimpsed a vulnerability that stirred something protective in him. "I have questions of my own about our traditions," she whispered, "and perhaps this is the moment to challenge them." From somewhere deeper in the cavern, a splash echoed, followed by hushed voices. Aelynn stiffened. "They're coming," she said. "We have to go." Rowan didn't resist as she grabbed his hand. He noticed how cool her fingers felt against his warm skin, the slight tremor that betrayed her fear. He followed her deeper into the cavern, wading through chest-deep water until they reached a natural tunnel. The stone walls glimmered with faint veins of color, as if streaks of opal had been woven into the rock. Steam hissed softly from hidden vents, casting the place in shifting currents of warmth and mist. "Down," she commanded, pointing to a submerged passage. Rowan's breath caught. He'd have to swim blindly. This was the sort of reckless act he usually avoided after his past mistakes. But the alternative, being cornered by her presumably hostile kin, didn't appeal to him. With a nod, he drew a lungful of air and followed her beneath the surface. The water was startlingly clear, yet the rocky corridor ahead loomed like a shadowy maw. Aelynn moved with inhuman grace, her limbs cutting through the water as if it were second nature. Rowan kicked behind her, struggling to keep up, his eyes stinging in the mineral-rich fluid. After a few seconds, his lungs began to burn. He saw Aelynn glance back, noticing his struggle, and she guided him upward to an air pocket. They surfaced, gasping, in a small chamber where the water lapped around them like a quiet lake. She placed a hand against his cheek, her opalescent eyes full of concern. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice echoing off the low ceiling. Rowan shook his head, blinking water from his lashes. "I'm fine," he replied. "Just not used to all this." He let out a shaky laugh. "I thought I was the one who knew these caverns best, but clearly you've lived here your whole life." Aelynn pressed her lips together. "I was trained to guard these waters, to defend them from intruders, but we rarely get them. Your arrival was unexpected." She paused, studying his face. "I see guilt in your eyes. Is it because you trespassed here?" Rowan swallowed. It was more than that, but he wasn't sure he could unravel his entire past in one breath. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was drawn by the geological readings. I've never seen anything like these thermal pools. They're a marvel." He hesitated, then added, "And yes, I do feel guilty. It's complicated. I have a history of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone paid the price for my mistakes once." She looked as though she wanted to ask more, but a splash behind them jolted her attention. Her ears twitched, and she nodded to a narrow ledge. Together they climbed onto it, water streaming off their bodies. Rowan shivered at the temperature shift, noticing for the first time that the chill in the air contrasted sharply with the warm water. Aelynn's gaze flicked to a corridor leading out of the chamber. "We can't stay here. My brothers are searching for you." He took a deep breath. "And you want to keep me alive." Aelynn's fingers trembled slightly at her sides, that subtle quirk that betrayed her emotions. "Yes," she whispered. "Even though everything in my upbringing tells me to kill you, I can't. There's more to life than these laws. I feel it." Rowan nodded, his mind churning with questions. "Then lead the way. I'll do my best to keep up." They moved through the corridor, the stone underfoot slick with condensation. Soft trickles of water ran down the walls, pooling in shallow streams that wove across the floor. The atmosphere felt charged, as though the planet's energy pulsed just behind the surface. Rowan's boots splashed in the rivulets, and he noticed how quietly Aelynn walked, each step measured, her posture alert. He tried to mimic her caution, placing his feet more gently. They reached another pool, this one illuminated by a faint radiance that seemed to filter in from above. The ceiling was open to the sky, revealing a patch of dusky blue overhead. Rowan could smell the crispness of the night air. Aelynn paused, peering upward. "We might climb out here," she said, voice hushed. "But it leaves us exposed. My brothers often keep watch." Rowan's chest tightened at the thought of being discovered. He glanced at Aelynn, noticing the way her eyes darted around the cavern as if calculating possibilities. "Is there another way?" She shook her head. "Not one that leads beyond the sacred boundaries. If we go back, we'll run into them. If we go forward, we risk being seen. But I'd rather risk the open than wait to be cornered." Her jaw set in determination. Rowan found himself strangely reassured by her resolve. Despite the unfamiliarity of the situation and the fact that she had threatened his life moments ago, he sensed a genuine concern for his well-being. "All right," he said, stepping closer to the pool's edge. "Let's do it." They waded in, the water chest-deep, and began swimming toward the patch of sky. The walls rose around them, smooth stone ridges that would be a challenge to scale. Aelynn reached the far edge first, where a rocky lip jutted out. She turned to help Rowan up. Her strength surprised him. Though she appeared delicate, she pulled him onto the ledge with practiced ease. The moment they both found footing, they heard voices echoing from the corridor they'd just left. Aylynn's eyes widened. "They're near," she whispered. Without further warning, she began climbing a natural chimney that extended toward the surface. Her movements were agile, each handhold and foothold chosen with precision. Rowan followed, adrenaline pounding in his veins. The stone was cold and damp beneath his fingers, and he forced himself to trust in each grip. Partway up, he glanced down and saw shadows dancing along the water's surface. Figures were moving into the chamber below. His heart thudded harder. If they looked up, they would see him clinging to the rock face. He pressed himself against the stone, holding his breath, praying the darkness concealed them. Aelynn reached a small outcropping first and turned back to help him. He grabbed her forearm, feeling the solidity of her muscle beneath that pale skin. She pulled him up, and they scrambled onto a narrow shelf. Above them, a sliver of moonlight gleamed through an opening no wider than a meter. Rowan felt a wave of relief. They were nearly out. A male voice, sharp and commanding, echoed below. "Find him! He cannot have gone far." The words were in the same halting dialect Aelynn had used when speaking to Rowan, but the anger was unmistakable. Aelynn placed a finger to her lips, urging Rowan to remain silent. Then, with remarkable agility, she pushed up through the narrow gap, her shoulders and torso vanishing into the night. Rowan waited a heartbeat, then followed. He felt the stone scrape his arms and back, and for a tense moment he thought he might get stuck, but with a final heave he emerged into open air. They lay sprawled on a rocky ledge, the night sky above them brilliant with unfamiliar constellations. A cool wind brushed over Rowan's damp clothes, sending a shiver down his spine. He looked over at Aelynn'rae, whose chest rose and fell quickly. Her eyes scanned the perimeter, searching for any sign of her brothers. The ridges around them were jagged silhouettes against the starry sky, and in the distance, Rowan could hear the faint rush of water over rocks. She touched his arm, drawing his attention. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice hushed. "They'll climb after us soon. I know a place where we can hide." He nodded, pushing himself upright. Every muscle in his body felt tense, ready for flight. "Lead the way," he managed, forcing calm into his tone. Aelynn'rae moved with that same fluid grace, keeping low to the ground. He followed her, marveling at how she seemed to blend into the shadows. If not for the pale shimmer of her skin in the moonlight, she might have vanished entirely. They skirted along the ridge, careful not to dislodge any loose stones. Below, the thermal pools glowed faintly with mineral reflections, and Rowan could see flickers of movement. Her brothers, presumably, spreading out to search. The night air carried an undercurrent of tension that prickled across his skin. He felt as though every breath he took might give them away. Aelynn'rae guided him to a narrow fissure in the rock face. It was almost invisible from a distance, but as they approached, Rowan could see it opened into another passage. She slipped inside, and he followed, the walls pressing close. It was dark, but after a few steps, the corridor opened into a small cavern. He heard the trickle of water somewhere in the gloom. Aelynn'rae found a smooth spot on the ground and sank to her knees, pressing her palms to the stone as though in prayer. Rowan waited, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. After a moment, she lifted her head and exhaled. "We're safe here for a little while. They don't know about this place." Rowan lowered himself onto a rock ledge. His mind buzzed with questions, but one thing stood out. "What did you mean about bonding me, so they won't kill me?" She wrapped her arms around her knees, her posture guarded. "In my people's law, if an outsider finds our sacred domain, they must be put to death to preserve the secret. But there's an ancient rite that allows for an outsider to be claimed by one of our own. It is rarely done. Usually we do not want outsiders among us." She looked away, her voice trembling slightly. "Bonding is intimate, a melding of lives. It was originally meant to unite tribes, but now it's used as a method of control." Rowan felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "So, if we do this, I become your property?" She grimaced. "Yes, at least that's how my brothers see it. You would be bound to me, and they would have no right to harm you without harming me. But it would also mean your freedom is lost. You would be tied to our laws, forced to live here in secrecy, serving the tribe." She paused, her gaze flicking over him. "I hate it. I don't want to force you into anything, but I also don't want to see you killed." He pressed his lips together, grappling with the gravity of the situation. "There must be another way," he said quietly. "I don't want to be the cause of more violence. I've had enough of that in my life. But if it comes down to life or death." Aelynn'rae closed her eyes, as though the weight of the choice pressed heavily on her. "Let's see if we can avoid it," she whispered. "Maybe we can find a path out of these caverns, far from my tribe's reach. But it won't be easy. They know these passages better than anyone." Rowan nodded. "Then we'd better be smarter. I'm a skilled surveyor. I can read geological formations. If we can find a route that's less obvious, maybe a submerged passage that leads away from the springs, we might slip past them." She looked at him with cautious hope. "You think you can find such a route?" He shrugged, feeling a hint of his old confidence stir. "I can try. I've studied the planet's topography. If I can recall the maps properly, there might be a series of underwater tunnels leading out to a lower basin. The only problem is that it might be blocked or partially collapsed." Aelynn'rae stood, her lithe form casting a faint silhouette in the darkness. "Show me," she said. "Help me understand what to look for." Rowan rose, stepping closer. He retrieved a small hollow projector from his belt, though it was cracked and flickered after the dunk in the water. With a few taps, he managed to bring up a dim, sputtering map. He pointed to the approximate area they were in, the topographical lines dancing unsteadily. "We're here, in this cluster of geothermal vents. The main caverns open up here." He gestured to a spot a bit further west. "But it's likely guarded. If we can find a route that drops beneath this ridge, we might emerge in the canyon on the other side. The water flows downward. I just need to figure out where the natural channels form." Aelynn peered at the map, her eyes reflecting the faint light. "There's a deep chasm below the central pool," she said. "We've never used it because it's treacherous, but perhaps that's the path we need." Rowan nodded, turning off the projector. "If it's treacherous, your brothers might not think to guard it. We'll have to be careful. Underwater tunnels can shift, especially if there's seismic activity, and these hot springs are definitely active." She gave a solemn nod, then stepped back. "We should rest a moment. You're tired. I can see it in your eyes." He wanted to deny it, but he felt the ache in his muscles, the tension in his shoulders. "A short rest," he conceded. "But we can't linger long." They sat in companionable silence, the faint trickle of water lulling Rowan's nerves. He found himself watching Aylynn's face, noting the fine contours of her cheekbones, the slight parting of her lips as she breathed. She caught him looking and held his gaze, and in the darkness he thought he saw a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Why do you want to keep me alive?" he asked softly. "Is it just your curiosity about outsiders, or is there more?" Aelynn studied him for a moment before answering. "I have questioned many of our customs for some time now. We live in isolation, guarding these springs as though they're the only precious thing in the universe. Our laws are strict. No one enters, no one leaves. When I was young, I asked why. My father told me it was to preserve our purity and our safety, but I've always wondered if we're missing something by never venturing beyond." She lowered her gaze. "Then you came, and I had a chance to see one of the outsiders we fear. And you don't seem like a monster. You're just another living being caught in circumstances. Killing you would bring me no honor." Rowan's chest tightened at her words. He felt a spark of empathy for her sense of confinement. "I'm sorry my presence caused trouble for you," he murmured, "but I'm grateful you're willing to give me a chance." She offered him a small, tentative smile. It was the first time he'd seen her lips curl in anything other than worry or grim determination. It lit something inside him, a sense of connection that transcended the fear swirling around them. He reached out and touched her hand lightly, and she didn't pull away. For a moment, they simply breathed in unison, letting the moment ground them. Then the sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere above, a distant shuffle of stones. Aylynn's fingers tensed under his. "We should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They might be tracking us." They stood, and Rowan felt a renewed determination. This time, he would not let his mistakes endanger someone else. He would rely on his expertise, and he would trust that Aelynn knew these caverns intimately. Together, perhaps they could navigate a path to safety, and in the process find a deeper understanding of one another. They made their way back out of the fissure, moving carefully across the rocky ledge. The night sky still stretched overhead, though the moon had shifted, casting new shadows across the terrain. Rowan followed Aelynn down a sloping path that clung to the mountainside, the stone underfoot crumbling in places. He gripped the rock walls for balance, every nerve on alert. A soft hum escaped his lips, an old earth melody he'd learned in his childhood. He often hummed when anxious, and the tune seemed to calm his racing heart. Aelynn glanced back at him, curiosity in her eyes. "What is that sound?" He flushed slightly, realizing she could hear him. "It's a habit," he admitted. "A song from home. Helps me focus." She listened for a moment, then turned away, continuing forward. He couldn't tell if she found it comforting or odd, but she didn't object. The path wound around a bend, and soon they found themselves overlooking a wide basin dotted with steam vents. The air shimmered with heat waves, and in the distance, Rowan could see the faint outlines of twisted rock formations that looked like spires in the moonlight. Aelynn paused, scanning the terrain. "We need to get down there," she said, pointing to a spot where the largest vent spewed warm air. "The chasm is beneath that vent. If we can reach it, we can dive down." Rowan nodded, though a knot of dread coiled in his stomach at the idea of another underwater descent. Still, he steeled himself. "Let's move." They descended carefully, sometimes sliding on loose gravel. Aelynn remained agile, while Rowan nearly lost his footing twice. Her hand shot out each time to steady him, her grip surprisingly strong. He felt the tension radiating from her as well. They both knew her brothers could be watching from any vantage point. When they reached the base of the slope, the steam enveloped them in a warm fog. The ground was slick with moisture, and pools of heated water dotted the area. The largest vent roared with a deep rumble, expelling jets of hot air that distorted the surrounding space with waves of heat. Aelynn led him toward a rocky overhang, beneath which a wide pool glistened with an uncanny sheen. Faint ribbons of light seemed to move beneath the surface, as though the water carried a living current of color. "This is it," she said quietly. "Below this pool is a network of tunnels. We only know bits of it from old stories. Most say it's a death trap." Rowan crouched by the water's edge, feeling the heat radiating from the surface. "If the water's too hot, we can't survive long," he murmured. He tentatively dipped his hand in. It was warm, almost scalding, but not enough to cause immediate burns. He let out a breath of relief. "It's hot, but maybe not lethal." Aelynn knelt beside him, her eyes reflecting the pool's subtle luminescence. "We should be careful. There could be pockets of intense heat or toxic gases." She looked at him. "I've trained to navigate underwater passages, but even I've never tried these depths." He met her gaze, sensing the gravity of their next move. "If we find a current that leads out, we might emerge in the canyon beyond. It's a risk, but staying here is a bigger one." She nodded, then placed a hand on his shoulder. He felt a subtle tremor there, a mixture of fear and resolve. "I will guide you as best I can," she said. "Stay close to me. If we get separated, we may never find each other again." Rowan swallowed hard, the thought of drowning alone in those depths chilling him. "I'll stay close," he promised. He stripped off any unnecessary gear, leaving only the essentials. Aelynn did the same, removing a few ornamental pieces that had been strapped around her arms and waist. He noticed faint marks on her skin, possibly from where the straps had dug in. They slipped into the water. It was hotter than he expected, almost uncomfortably so, but still bearable. Aelynn drew in a breath, then submerged. Rowan followed, heart hammering. The world beneath the surface was surreal. The water carried swirling streams of minerals, casting an otherworldly shimmer. The stone walls curved in natural arches, and he could feel the pressure of the water against his body as though it were alive and shifting. Aelynn led him downward, following a narrow crevice. He used his arms to propel himself, kicking as steadily as he could. The heat made his skin prickle, and he tried not to think about how long his air would last. After several meters, the passage widened into a chamber. Bubbles rose from cracks in the floor, indicating pockets of geothermal activity. Aelynn swam close, her hair streaming behind her like dark ribbons. She glanced back at him, her eyes luminous in the filtered light. They pressed onward, descending into a deeper channel. The pressure on Rowan's ears increased, and he paused to equalize, releasing small bursts of air from his nose. Aelynn waited, placing a hand on his arm, her expression reassuring. He nodded, and they continued. At one point, they came across a sudden drop-off, a vertical tunnel that plummeted into darkness. Aelynn peered over the edge, her expression uncertain. Rowan felt a surge of adrenaline. They had no idea what waited below, but turning back was not an option. She glanced at him, and he gave a tentative nod. They began to descend, letting the gentle current carry them down. The darkness became absolute, broken only by faint streaks of color in the mineral-laden water. Rowan's lungs began to burn, and panic fluttered at the edges of his consciousness. He realized they would need air soon. He tapped Aelynn's shoulder, and she pointed to a narrow shelf that jutted from the tunnel's side. They swam to it, finding a small air pocket above. Rowan burst to the surface, gasping, while Aelynn inhaled more calmly, though he could see the relief in her face. The chamber was cramped, the ceiling just high enough for them to keep their heads above water. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice echoing off the dripping walls. He coughed, nodding. "Just not used to holding my breath that long." She brushed a hand over his shoulder, a fleeting gesture of comfort. "We'll rest here a moment, then continue. The water seems to flow out. Maybe there's an exit if we follow the current." He leaned against the rock, his body shaking with exertion. "I hope so," he murmured. His eyes traveled over her face, and he noticed she was shivering too, despite the heat. It wasn't from cold, perhaps from nerves or from the toll this was taking on her. He realized she was risking everything to help him, an outsider who'd stumbled into her sacred domain. The gratitude he felt was overwhelming. She turned her gaze to him. "Rowan, I don't know if we'll make it, but I'm not sorry I tried." He swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "I'm not sorry either." He reached out, gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek. Her skin felt as smooth as polished stone under his fingertips. She closed her eyes at his touch, and for a moment the tension between them shifted into something else, a quiet intimacy born of shared danger and a fragile trust. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. They stayed like that, breathing in unison, water dripping around them, hearts pounding. Aylynn's lips parted, and in a soft, hesitant motion, she kissed him. The contact was brief, tentative, but it sent a surge of warmth through Rowan's chest, chasing away the chill of fear. He kissed her back, savoring the taste of her, a mingling of mineral water and something uniquely her own. When they parted, she exhaled shakily, eyes shining. "We should keep going," she whispered. "We'll find another air pocket soon." He nodded, his breath unsteady. "Right." They submerged once more, pushing deeper into the vertical tunnel. The pressure intensified, and Rowan's ears ached. He forced himself to focus, scanning the walls for any sign of an opening. Aelynn guided him with gentle taps on his arm whenever they needed to change direction. The current became stronger, tugging them downward. He realized with a spike of panic that if they didn't find an opening soon, they might be swept along without any chance to surface. Just as his lungs felt ready to burst, he spotted a faint glow in the distance. Aelynn angled toward it, swimming with all her strength. He followed, heart pounding. The glow came from a fissure in the rock, a crack that let in a beam of pale moonlight. They surfaced in a large cavern, gulping air. Rowan coughed, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The water here was cooler, indicating they might be nearing an exit. They clung to the rocky edge, looking around. The cavern opened to the sky through a jagged hole in the ceiling, perhaps 30 feet above them. A sliver of moonlight spilled in, illuminating the chamber in ghostly silver. Stalactites hung like teeth, and the water was a dark pool beneath them. A gentle breeze stirred, hinting at an opening to the outside, somewhere beyond the walls. Aelynn let out a breath. "We made it," she whispered. "We're past the main springs." Rowan pressed his forehead against the rock, relief surging through him. "Thank you," he said softly, meeting her eyes. "I couldn't have done that alone." She offered a small smile, though her face was drawn with exhaustion. "Nor could I. We needed each other." They hauled themselves onto a narrow ledge, dripping and shaking. Rowan felt the aftershock of adrenaline in his limbs. Aelynn settled beside him, her shoulders touching his. They sat in silence for a long moment, just breathing and letting the tension subside. The water lapped softly at the rocks, and the moonlight revealed the patterns on her skin in subtle detail, those frost-like veins seeming to pulse with her heartbeat. He reached for her hand, and she intertwined her fingers with his, her grip firm. The memory of her kiss lingered between them, and despite their dire circumstances, he felt a powerful pull toward her. Her presence was soothing, a balm for his fears. He leaned in, brushing his lips against her temple. She turned her face toward him, eyes reflecting the moonlight, and he captured her mouth in a slow, lingering kiss. Her response was immediate and urgent, as though the near-death experience had heightened every sensation. She pressed closer, her free hand sliding around his waist. Their bodies were slick with water, the scent of minerals still clinging to their skin. Rowan felt his heart race with a mixture of desire and gratitude. He let his hand trace the line of her jaw, then moved down to the elegant curve of her neck, where he felt the subtle throbbing of her pulse. Aelynn's breath caught. She pulled him closer, and their kiss deepened, hunger and relief merging in a swirl of emotion. The cavern echoed with the soft sounds of their breath and the gentle slap of water against the stone. Rowan let himself be carried by the moment, the warmth of her body against his, the press of her lips, the slide of her fingers across his damp skin. Aelynn broke the kiss, her cheeks flushed. She glanced away, as if uncertain whether to continue. Rowan gently cupped her chin, guiding her gaze back to his. "It's all right," he whispered. "We're safe here for now. You don't have to hold back." She exhaled, a tremor passing through her. "I've never been with an outsider," she admitted, her voice raw with honesty. "Our ways, they teach us that bonding with someone beyond the tribe is a violation, but I feel—" She trailed off, searching his eyes. "I feel drawn to you, Rowan. I don't want to pretend otherwise." Indeed, he stroked a thumb across her cheek. "I feel it too, and I don't want to run from it." Their lips met again, and this time there was no hesitation. Aelynn shifted onto his lap, her thighs straddling him as she wrapped her arms around his shoulders. Their bodies pressed together, hearts pounding in tandem. Rowan's hands slid over her waist, feeling the delicate contours of her ribs beneath that smooth skin. She shivered under his touch, and he marveled at the contrast of her cool exterior and the heat that burned between them. He leaned back against the stone, letting her set the pace. She kissed along his jaw, then down his neck, each brush of her lips sending sparks of pleasure through him. He closed his eyes, savoring the sensation of her hair against his skin, the faint tickle of her pointed ears when he ran his fingers through her dark locks. She murmured something in her native tongue, the words low and breathy, and though he didn't understand, he felt their meaning in the way she clung to him. The tension of survival mingled with raw desire, and they let themselves be consumed by it. Their hands roamed, exploring every contour, every scar. Rowan traced the frost vein patterns across her collarbones, feeling them respond with a subtle flutter. She gasped, arching against him, and he kissed the hollow of her throat, tasting the salt of her skin. It felt like a revelation, a connection that transcended their differences. Soon, the world around them faded into a haze of sensation. Their clothes, already clinging wetly to their bodies, became an afterthought. She tugged at his shirt, and he helped peel it off, tossing it aside. Her own attire slipped away with his assistance, revealing more of those pale, shifting patterns across her torso and hips. He couldn't help but stare in awe, and she gazed at him with a hint of self-consciousness. But his reverent look seemed to soothe any doubts, and she leaned in once more. Their kisses grew more fervent, breaths ragged. Aelynn pressed her forehead to his, her voice trembling with need. "Rowan," she whispered, as if his name itself was a plea. He answered by guiding her closer, their bodies aligning in a way that made his pulse thunder. She moved against him, slow and deliberate, eliciting a soft moan from his lips. He let his hands roam down her back, feeling each vertebra, each subtle curve, until he reached the base of her spine. She mirrored his exploration, her touch sending jolts of pleasure through him. When they finally joined, it was with a gasp of shared wonder. Their bodies fit together as though some cosmic force had willed it, forging a bond in the darkness of that hidden cavern. They moved in a slow, sensuous rhythm, each motion a discovery of the other's form. Aelynn's breath hitched with each subtle shift, and Rowan felt his own heart pound in a wild staccato. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her scent, drowning in the heady mixture of mineral water and her own natural musk. She murmured words he didn't know, and yet he understood them in the timbre of her voice, a soft surrender, a blossoming trust. Time lost meaning. Their breathing grew labored, punctuated by soft cries and muffled groans. The water around the ledge rippled with their movements, reflecting moonlight in dancing patterns on the cavern walls. The moment built, tension coiling between them like a spring, until it finally released in a rush of pleasure that left them both trembling. Aelynn clung to him, her forehead pressed to his, eyes squeezed shut as she gasped for air. Rowan stroked her hair, planting tender kisses along her temple. She let out a breath that shuddered with emotion, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as their heartbeats gradually slowed. For a long while they remained entwined, the water lapping softly, the moonlight their only witness. Eventually, Aelynn eased back, though she didn't leave his embrace. Her eyes shone with tears she tried to hide. "That was—" she began, but words failed her. He pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Yes," he whispered. He didn't need to say more. The moment spoke for itself. They had risked their lives together, faced death, and found an unexpected connection. The intensity of it all left him breathless. Aelynn rested her head on his shoulder. "I've never felt like this," she confessed. "My people, we bond as a form of tradition or necessity, but I never knew it could feel so genuine." Rowan tightened his arms around her. "Neither did I," he admitted, thinking of how hollow his life had felt since the accident that claimed his teammate. He had been drifting from one assignment to another, avoiding deep connections. And now, in the midst of danger, he'd found something that felt undeniably real. They remained in silence, letting the afterglow settle. The caverns seemed peaceful, the distant rush of water soothing. But the reality of their situation began to seep back in. Aelynn lifted her head, her gaze growing somber. "We're still not safe," she murmured. "My brothers won't stop looking for us." Rowan nodded, a pang of regret piercing his chest. He wished they could stay like this, locked in the warmth of each other's presence, but that was a fantasy, and reality demanded action. "We should find a way out of this cavern," he said. "If the canyon lies beyond, we might slip away for good." She rose, gracefully sliding off his lap, and he stood as well, helping her retrieve their discarded clothing. They dressed in silence, exchanging glances that spoke of the bond they now shared. Once clothed, they made their way around the pool, searching for a path. The cavern's walls were sheer, but the hole in the ceiling offered a potential escape if they could climb up to it. Aelynn tested the rock, looking for handholds. Rowan joined her, his surveying instincts kicking in. "We might be able to use those stalactites," he said, pointing to a cluster that hung near the opening. "If we can swing or climb onto them, we could reach the lip of the hole." She nodded, and they set to work, moving carefully. The rock was slippery, and more than once Rowan's heart lurched as he felt his foot slip. Aelynn proved her agility, finding holds he would have missed. At one point he lost his grip, and she grabbed his arm, her slender muscles flexing as she pulled him back. Their eyes locked, and he saw the fear in her face at almost losing him. He managed a shaky smile. "Thanks." Together they inched upward. It was a slow, precarious process, but eventually Aelynn hooked her arm around a stalactite and pulled herself onto a ledge. She extended a hand to Rowan, and he hauled himself up beside her. From there, they could reach the lip of the hole. A cold draught of night air swept in, making Rowan shiver in his damp clothes. But it also carried the scent of open sky, a promise of freedom. They climbed out onto the rocky plateau above the cavern. The moon had drifted lower in the sky, and dawn was not far off. The horizon glowed with a faint hint of purple. Rowan surveyed the landscape, a rugged expanse of canyons and cliffs carved by ancient rivers. The hot springs lay behind them, hidden in the folds of the terrain. He exhaled, relieved to see no immediate sign of pursuit. Aelynn stood beside him, her eyes scanning the distance. "If we keep going that way," she said, pointing toward a gap in the canyon walls, "we might reach the lower basin by midday. My tribe rarely ventures there, as it's considered barren and lifeless." Rowan nodded. "Then that's where we'll go." He glanced at her, remembering the risk she was taking. "If you leave with me, what happens to you? Won't they come after you for breaking their laws?" She looked away, her shoulders tense. "I'll be an outcast. My father, my brothers, they won't forgive this, but perhaps it's time I made my own path." He took her hand, squeezing gently. "You don't have to do this for me." Aelynn turned, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "I'm not just doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. I've felt trapped for so long, questioning our isolation, our fear of the outside world. If I stay, I'll never know what else is out there. I'll never know if my doubts could lead to something better." A surge of admiration welled in Rowan's chest. "Then let's face it together." They set off across the rocky plateau, guided by the faint light of the approaching dawn. The terrain was unforgiving, a patchwork of jagged ridges and sudden drop-offs. But Rowan's surveying skills proved invaluable, and Aylynn's agility and sharp senses helped them navigate safely. They paused only to sip water from a trickling spring and share a bit of the dried provisions Rowan carried. As they walked, Aelynn asked him about his world, about the people beyond her tribe's domain. He told her of bustling colonies on distant planets, of towering spires of metal and glass, of deserts and oceans that dwarfed these canyons. She listened with rapt attention, occasionally shaking her head in wonder. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing that colonization often brought exploitation. But he also spoke of the potential for cultural exchange, of alliances and friendships forged across the stars. Her eyes shone with curiosity. "Your world must be so vast," she murmured. "It makes me realize how small my own life has been." He reached for her hand. "Small, perhaps, but it's yours. And now, you have the chance to see more, if that's what you truly want." She gave him a faint smile, though her gaze flickered with uncertainty. "I'm afraid. I don't know what lies ahead. But I know I can't go back." Rowan squeezed her hand, wishing he could reassure her more. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." They traveled in silence for a while, the sun slowly cresting the horizon behind them. The temperature began to rise, the air growing hot and dry. Rowan led them along a winding path that descended into a canyon. The walls rose on either side, streaked with layers of red and brown stone. At times they had to scramble over boulders or navigate narrow ledges. The memory of their intimate moment in the cavern lingered between them like a comforting warmth, a reminder that they weren't alone. Around midday, they reached a wide basin, the ground flattened, cracked and dry like an ancient riverbed. Heat shimmered in the distance, and Rowan spotted what looked like a small oasis near the far side. A few stunted trees stood there, and he could almost taste the relief of shade and water. Aelynn gazed at the scene, her expression tinged with awe. "I've never been here," she admitted. "It's so open." He understood what she meant. After the claustrophobic confines of the caverns, the expanse felt liberating, if a bit intimidating. "We'll rest at that oasis," he said, pointing, "then decide our next move." They made their way across the cracked earth, the sun beating down. Aelynn shielded her eyes, clearly unaccustomed to such intense light. Rowan offered her a scrap of cloth from his gear to drape over her head. She accepted gratefully, though her pointed ears still peeked out, twitching at the unfamiliar environment. When they reached the oasis, they found a small spring trickling out from a cluster of rocks. The water formed a shallow pool surrounded by patches of hardy grasses. Rowan knelt to refill his canteen, and Aelynn joined him, scooping water into her hands. She drank, letting out a sigh of relief. Then she splashed her face, shaking droplets from her dark hair. Rowan settled in the shade of a gnarled tree, leaning his back against the trunk. Aelynn sat beside him, her legs folded gracefully beneath her. He offered her a ration bar, and she took it, studying it curiously before taking a tentative bite. She made a face at the bland taste, but ate it anyway. After they finished, Aelynn rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she murmured, "for showing me a different path." He brushed a hand through her hair, feeling a swell of affection. "I'm just grateful you saved my life. Several times, actually." He thought of the moment in the pool when she'd first spoken those ominous words. He also remembered her determination in the underwater tunnels and the way she'd pulled him up when he almost fell. She had risked everything for him. He wanted to be worthy of that trust. She tilted her head up, her gaze soft. "You would have done the same for me." He didn't argue, though he knew it was her courage that had truly made the difference. He pressed a light kiss to her forehead. They sat in a comfortable hush, the rustle of leaves overhead and the trickle of water forming a lullaby of sorts. After a while, Aylynn's eyes drifted closed, and Rowan realized she was exhausted. He gently eased her to lie against his chest, letting her rest. As she slept, he watched the horizon. His mind churned with the reality of their situation. They had escaped the tribe for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her brothers might still pursue them. And even if they didn't, what then? He was an off-worlder, employed by a corporation that might see Aylynn's people as obstacles to resource extraction. He felt a surge of protectiveness. He wouldn't let them exploit her home. He let out a slow breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Maybe there was a way to negotiate a peaceful agreement or to keep the corporation away from these springs altogether. But first, he needed to ensure Aylynn's safety. If they could find a settlement or outpost, they might secure transport off this planet. Or perhaps they could stay in the wilderness, hidden from prying eyes. The future was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't abandon her. Aelynn stirred, her eyelashes fluttering open. She looked up at him with a drowsy smile. "I fell asleep," she murmured, sounding slightly embarrassed. He stroked her hair. "You needed it. We both did." She sat up, stretching. Her eyes roamed the basin, taking in the stark beauty of the rocky landscape under the midday sun. "So this is the world outside my tribe," she said softly. "Harsh, yet full of possibility." Rowan nodded. "That's one way to put it. There's danger, but there's also freedom. You get to choose your path." She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "And you, Rowan? What do you choose now?" He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "I choose to stand by you. I owe you my life, and I want to see what we can become together." Her lips curved in a shy smile. She leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to his mouth. The heat of the sun, the warmth of her lips, and the soft hush of the oasis around them made the moment feel surreal. He pulled her closer, savoring the contact. She parted her lips against his, inviting a deeper kiss, and he let himself get lost in the tenderness of it. After a long moment, she pulled away, cheeks flushed. "We should keep moving soon," she said. "I don't want to risk being found here." He agreed, and they gathered their things. They set off once more, crossing the basin toward a gap in the canyon wall. As they walked, they spoke in hushed tones about their pasts. Rowan told her more about the accident that haunted him, the day a rock slide he'd misjudged killed his teammate. He had survived, battered and guilt-ridden, and ever since, he'd questioned his own judgment, second-guessed every decision. Aelynn listened intently, her eyes reflecting empathy. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can see the pain in your eyes. But you saved me more than once. That tells me you're not defined by your mistakes." Her words were like a balm on an old wound. He squeezed her hand. "Thank you. I'm trying to forgive myself. Maybe with you I can finally learn how." She gave him a comforting smile. "And perhaps I can learn to break free from the rules that bound me. We can discover a new way, together." The sun edged westward, casting elongated shadows across the canyon floor. They navigated the winding passages, sometimes spotting small desert creatures scurrying among the rocks. Aelynn marveled at each new sight: a lizard basking in the sun, a bird darting across the sky. Her childlike wonder made Rowan smile. He realized that she'd been sheltered in many ways, denied the broader experience of the world beyond her tribe's domain. As dusk approached, they found another small spring trickling down a cliff face, forming a narrow waterfall into a natural basin. It wasn't large, but it provided enough water to drink and bathe. The heat of the day had sapped their energy, so they decided to stop there for the night. Rowan helped clear a small area for them to rest, gathering stones into a makeshift circle for a fire pit. While he worked, Aelynn slipped under the waterfall, letting the water cascade over her. She closed her eyes, lifting her face to the sky, her expression serene. Rowan paused to watch, entranced by her graceful form, the way the setting sun highlighted the subtle lines of her body. When she opened her eyes and caught him staring, a faint blush colored her cheeks, and she beckoned him over. He joined her under the falling water, the coolness a stark contrast to the day's heat. She placed her hands on his shoulders, her gaze tender. "We survived another day," she said softly. "Maybe we can keep surviving, one day at a time." He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "We will," he promised. The water drummed against them, washing away the sweat and dust. They embraced, letting the cascade envelop them, the sound muffling the outside world. The intimacy of it reminded Rowan of the cavern, where they'd first shared a deeper connection. Aelynn seemed to remember, too, her eyes drifting shut as she pressed her lips to his throat. He wrapped his arms around her waist, guiding her closer. Her skin was cool under the waterfall, but her body felt warm against his. She let out a soft sigh, tilting her head back, exposing her neck. He trailed kisses there, reveling in the slight hitch of her breath. They stood like that for a while, letting the water tumble over them, locked in a moment of quiet passion that felt like a blessing in a harsh world. Eventually, they stepped out, dripping and refreshed. Rowan gathered a few bits of brush and dried wood he found in the canyon, managing to coax a small fire into life. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the rock walls. Aelynn sat beside him, knees drawn to her chest, watching the sparks swirl upward. She glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "In my tribe, fire is rarely used. We have heated water, natural vents. But open flames are considered dangerous." He looked at the fire, realizing it was a mundane thing for him, but a novelty for her. "It can be dangerous if not controlled," he admitted, "but it can also be comforting, especially on a cold night." She extended her hand toward the flames, feeling the warmth. "So many things I never knew," she murmured. "I'm both excited and terrified." He draped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I understand. I've felt that way too, stepping onto unfamiliar worlds." She rested her head against his chest. "Rowan, if we manage to get off this planet, will I be free? Or will I become just another curiosity to your people?" The question stung. He realized how easily her unique nature could become exploited or misunderstood. "I won't let anyone treat you like a curiosity," he said firmly. "You have a right to choose your own destiny. If you want to see the stars, I'll show you. If you want to find a quiet place far from everyone, I'll help you do that too." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You speak as though you can protect me from anything." He smiled, a touch of self-deprecation in his tone. "I can't promise that, but I can promise I'll try." He brushed a kiss to her temple. "You're not alone anymore." Aylynn's gaze softened. She turned and nestled against him, letting the heat of the fire and the warmth of his embrace lull her. The day's trials weighed heavily on them both, and before long, their eyelids grew heavy. They decided to keep a light watch, though exhaustion claimed them more quickly than they expected. Rowan drifted into a half-sleep, his senses still on alert for any sign of danger. He dreamed of water-filled caverns and the echo of Aylynn's voice, calling his name in the darkness. When he stirred awake, The fire had burned low, and the canyon was bathed in moonlight again. Aelynn slept peacefully beside him, her breathing soft. He checked the surroundings, listening for any unusual sounds. Hearing nothing, he let himself relax, leaning against the rock and drifting off once more. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sun's rays creeping over the canyon rim. Aelynn woke first, nudging Rowan gently. He blinked awake, yawning, and she smiled. "We should keep moving," she said. "I want to put as much distance between us and the springs as possible." He agreed, stretching stiff muscles. They doused the remnants of the fire, drank from the waterfall, and resumed their journey. The canyon wound onward, sometimes opening into wide, sun-scorched flats, other times narrowing into twisting passages. Occasionally, they had to backtrack when the path became impassable. Rowan hummed quietly to himself when nerves threatened to overwhelm him, and Aelynn listened, occasionally asking him about the melodies. Around midday, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold, voices echoing off the canyon walls. Aelynn froze, her pointed ears twitching. She recognized the dialect. "My brothers," she whispered, eyes wide with alarm. Rowan's stomach clenched. He scanned the area for a place to hide. The canyon floor was mostly bare rock, with only a few boulders for cover. "Over there," he hissed, pointing to a crevice in the canyon wall. They rushed to it, pressing themselves into the shadows. Aelynn peeked around the edge, her heart hammering in her chest. 3 figures appeared in the distance, their silhouettes distinct. Her brothers, clad in light garments that allowed freedom of movement, each armed with slender blades strapped to their thighs. They moved with a predatory grace, scanning the terrain, calling out in their language. Aylynn's chest tightened. They were searching for her, and for Rowan. Rowan felt a surge of guilt. She was now hunted by her own family, because of him. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but she remained tense. The brothers drew nearer, their voices growing clearer. Aylynn's breath caught when she recognized one of them as the eldest, Aelynn'rae, known for his unwavering loyalty to the tribe's laws. If anyone would enforce the death sentence, it was him. Aelynn'rae stopped, stooping to examine the ground. He spoke in a low tone, and the others nodded. They spread out, stepping carefully, eyes raking the canyon floor. Rowan realized they must have found footprints or some sign of passage. He squeezed Aylynn's hand, and she looked at him with silent dread. They waited, hearts pounding, as the brothers came within mere yards of their hiding place. The tension was suffocating. Aelynn felt a flicker of hope when it seemed they might pass by, but Aelynn'rae paused suddenly, his gaze swinging toward the crevice. He stepped forward, suspicion etched in his features. Aelynn braced herself, preparing for a confrontation. But at that moment a sudden gust of wind whipped through the canyon, stirring dust and sand into a swirling cloud. The brothers shielded their eyes, cursing. Rowan seized the opportunity. He grabbed Aylynn's hand, and they slipped deeper into the crevice, following a narrow passage that angled downward. The wind and dust concealed their movements, and by the time Aelynn'rae's vision cleared, they were gone. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, the passage eventually widening into a side canyon. They ran until their lungs burned, until they were certain the voices had faded behind them. Finally, they slowed, collapsing against a rock face to catch their breath. Aylynn's face was pale, her veins pulsing faintly with adrenaline. Rowan stroked her hair, trying to calm her. "That was too close," he said between gasps. She nodded, still trembling. "Aelynn'rae, he's the most feared warrior in my tribe. He won't stop until he finds us." She looked up at Rowan, eyes brimming with worry. "What do we do?" He took a moment to think, wiping sweat from his brow. "We keep moving, but we need to be more careful. They're tracking us by signs on the ground. We need to find a way to mask our trail." Aelynn considered this. "If we follow a stream or a riverbed, we can move through water to hide our footprints." Rowan nodded. "Good idea. Let's see if the side canyon leads to any water source." They pressed on, adrenaline still coursing through them. After another hour of walking, they found a narrow ravine where water trickled along the base. It wasn't much, but it was enough to wade through and mask their tracks. They followed the rivulet, stepping carefully over rocks, mindful of any noise. Eventually, the ravine opened into a larger valley. The water broadened into a shallow stream. Here, the terrain was dotted with hardy shrubs and twisted trees that clung to life in the arid environment. Rowan surveyed the area, noting the tall cliffs on either side. "If we keep to the stream, we might be less visible," he said, "but we'll also be confined by the cliffs." Aelynn'rae frowned. "We have to balance concealment with the risk of being trapped." She glanced up at the steep walls. "Climbing out would be difficult if they catch up to us here." He studied the cliffs. "True. Maybe we can move along the stream until nightfall, then try to ascend the cliffs under cover of darkness." She nodded. "Let's do that." They walked in the shallow water, leaving almost no footprints. The sun beat down, but the stream kept them relatively cool. Aelynn'rae seemed more comfortable now that she'd adapted to the dryness. She splashed water over her arms and neck, trying to remain alert. Rowan kept an eye on the sky, watching the sun's position. He estimated they had a few hours before dusk. As they rounded a bend in the stream, they heard a rustling in the brush. Rowan tensed, motioning for Aelynn'rae to stop. They crouched behind a rock, hearts pounding. A figure emerged, tall and imposing. At first, Rowan feared it was another of her brothers, but he quickly realized this was someone else, a robed traveler with a pack slung over their shoulder. The traveler seemed to be collecting water, unaware of their presence. Rowan exchanged a glance with Aelynn'rae. Should they reveal themselves or hide? The traveler was alone and might be friendly, or might be hostile, but maybe they could help. Aelynn'rae nodded hesitantly, and Rowan stood, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Hello," he called softly, his voice echoing in the canyon. The traveler spun around, startled, a hand going to the hilt of a blade at their belt. Rowan kept his hands up. "We mean no harm," he added. The traveler eyed them warily, taking in Rowan's human features and Aelynn'rae's alien appearance. After a tense moment, they relaxed slightly. "What are you doing out here?" the traveler asked in a gruff tone, though not overtly hostile. Rowan glanced at Aelynn'rae, then back at the stranger. "We're travelers passing through. We were looking for water." The traveler eyed them both, noting their soaked footwear. "Plenty of water here, though not many people roam these parts. It's dangerous." Aelynn'rae stepped forward, her voice gentle. "We're trying to reach safety," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Have you seen others like me, or men who might be hunting us?" The traveler scratched their chin, squinting at Aelynn'rae's elongated ears and the faint patterns on her skin. "I did see a small group earlier. They asked me if I'd seen a man and a woman pass by, described a pale woman with pointed ears. I told them no, but they seemed determined. They headed north." Rowan's stomach sank. "They're close, then." The traveler shrugged. "Not too far. You'd best watch your backs. They didn't look friendly." They paused, eyeing Rowan's utility belt. "You got any trade?" "I have a small skiff a bit further down the canyon. It can take you across the dunes faster than walking." Rowan hesitated. "A skiff? A hover sled, basically. Runs on solar charge. The dunes beyond this canyon are brutal to cross on foot." Rowan and Aelynn'rae exchanged glances. This could be their chance to put more distance between them and her brothers. "What do you want in return?" Rowan asked. The traveler looked him up and down. "Something of value. Supplies, gear. I'll need enough to make my next trip worthwhile." Rowan rifled through his belt, pulling out a small multi-tool device with scanning capability. It was advanced technology, worth a decent amount. "How about this?" he offered. The traveler examined it, turning it over. "Useful," they grunted. "Deal. Follow me. My skiff's hidden near a rocky outcrop about half a mile that way." Aelynn'rae regarded the traveler with caution, but she nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. They walked in silence, the traveler leading the way. Rowan kept a hand near his sidearm just in case, but the traveller seemed genuine enough, neither eager to harm them nor to pry too deeply into their situation. Eventually, they reached a patch of boulders. Hidden behind them was a small hover sled, a flat platform with a control panel at the front. It was dusty and worn, but functional. "Just power it up, and it'll carry you across the dunes," the traveller explained. "It's good for 2 people, maybe 3 if you're light. But you'll need to keep it charged with the solar panels here." They tapped a folded set of panels on the side. Rowan nodded, impressed by the simplicity of the design. He handed over the multi-tool, and the traveller gave him a curt nod. "You might want to go now, before those people hunting you catch up." "Thank you," Rowan said earnestly. Aelynn'rae echoed his gratitude, and the traveller just shrugged, pocketing the multi-tool. Without further ceremony, they parted ways, the traveller disappearing back up the canyon. Rowan and Aelynn'rae secured their belongings on the hoversled. Aelynn'rae ran her hand over the controls, curiosity shining in her eyes. "This is unlike anything I've seen," she said. Rowan chuckled. "It's not too complicated. Just stand here, control your direction with this lever, and the sled hovers a few inches off the ground." He activated the power, and the machine whirred to life, lifting slightly. Aelynn'rae gasped, stepping on gingerly. They set off, gliding across the sandy terrain. The sensation was surreal, as though they were floating. Aelynn'rae clutched Rowan's arm at first, but soon relaxed, marveling at the speed. The wind whipped through their hair, carrying grains of sand that stung their cheeks. Rowan kept one eye on the energy readings, mindful of the limited solar charge. They had maybe a few hours of good travel before they'd need to let it recharge. They steered toward a gap between 2 towering dunes, the sun dipping low in the sky. The desert stretched out before them, a vast sea of golden sand. Aelynn'rae stared in wonder at the rolling dunes, the sky tinted with hues of orange and pink. "It's so empty," she said, awe coloring her voice, "and yet it feels alive in its own way." Rowan nodded. "Every environment has its life, sometimes hidden, sometimes subtle." He pointed to faint tracks in the sand, possibly from small desert creatures. "See, there's always more than meets the eye." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad I'm seeing it with you." His chest warmed at her words. They rode in companionable silence for a time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky exploded into a tapestry of fiery reds and golds, reflecting off the dunes in a breathtaking display. Rowan slowed the sled as the light began to fade. "We should find a place to camp," he said. "Traveling at night might be dangerous, especially if we can't see obstacles." Aelynn'rae agreed. They located a rocky outcrop that provided some shelter from the wind. Rowan powered down the sled to conserve energy and extended the solar panel so it could recharge in the fading light, as well as the early morning sun. They set up a small camp, using what was left of their supplies. Aelynn'rae helped gather bits of dry brush for a fire, a skill she was quickly picking up. Once they had a small fire crackling, they settled in for the night. The desert temperature dropped swiftly, and Rowan wrapped an arm around Aelynn'rae to keep her warm. She snuggled close, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "We're really doing this," she murmured, as though still surprised by how far they'd come. "I've never been this far from my home." He kissed the top of her head. "You're forging your own path now. I'm proud of you." She gazed at him, emotions shining in her eyes. "I wouldn't have had the courage without you." They shared a soft kiss, the desert wind swirling around them. The firelight danced on their faces, highlighting the trust and affection that had grown between them. Eventually, they curled up together, drifting off under the starlit sky, lulled by the quiet hush of the dunes. Morning came with a blaze of sunlight, heating the sands quickly. They packed up and checked the sled's charge. It was enough to continue their journey. Rowan estimated that if they kept a steady pace, they might reach a known trade route on the far side of the dunes by midday. From there, they could find transport to a settlement. They glided over the sand, the engine humming beneath them. Aelynn'rae watched the dunes pass by, occasionally pointing out shapes or patterns that caught her eye. Rowan focused on navigation, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. His mind drifted to what lay ahead. He'd have to figure out how to protect Aelynn'rae from any corporate interest that might exploit her people's domain. Perhaps he could falsify the data on the springs, label them as unstable or uninhabitable. It was risky, but if it kept her tribe safe, it would be worth it. As the morning wore on, the heat became oppressive, and the sled's battery drained faster in the intense conditions. Rowan frowned at the gauge, which dipped into the lower range. "We might have to stop soon to let it recharge again," he said, raising his voice above the wind. Aelynn'rae nodded, squinting at the horizon. "Look there," she said, pointing. "I see movement." Rowan followed her gaze and spotted a caravan of sorts, several vehicles, possibly merchant transports. They were too far to identify clearly, but it was a sign of civilization. He guided the sled toward them, slowing as they approached. The caravan appeared to be a mix of hover trucks and mechanical walkers, traveling along a packed sand route. Merchants and travelers bustled around, exchanging goods and supplies. Rowan pulled the sled to a stop a safe distance away, not wanting to startle them. He waved a hand in greeting, and a few curious faces turned their way. A tall figure in desert robes approached, raising a hand in return. "Greetings, strangers," the figure called. "Need any help?" Rowan hopped off the sled, Aelynn'rae following close behind. "We're looking to reach a settlement," he explained. "Any chance you're heading that way?" The robed figure, who introduced themselves as a merchant named Aelynn'rae, nodded. "We're bound for Corva Outpost, a few hours east by Walker. You can join us if you like." Rowan exchanged a glance with Aelynn'rae. She looked nervous at the prospect of more strangers, but also recognized they needed help. He turned back to Aelynn'rae. "That would be appreciated. We have a hover sled, but the battery is low. We might not make it on our own." Aelynn'rae shrugged. "We can tow it. You'll travel slower than usual, but it'll get you there." They eyed Aelynn'rae curiously, but didn't ask questions. Rowan was grateful for their discretion. They arranged a tow line, securing the sled behind one of the walkers. Rowan and Aelynn'rae climbed onto the back of the vehicle, settling among crates of goods. The caravan set off, plodding steadily across the dunes. Aelynn'rae watched the merchants with fascination, noting the variety of items, textiles, spices, mechanical parts. A few curious glances were cast her way, but no one approached with hostility. After a while, Aelynn'rae sidled up to them, offering a canteen of water. Rowan thanked them, taking a drink. "What brings you to these parts?" Aelynn'rae asked, though their tone was casual. Rowan hesitated, then gave a vague answer about exploring. Aelynn'rae remained quiet, her hand resting lightly on Rowan's arm. Aelynn'rae seemed satisfied enough, not prying further. They spoke instead about the outpost, a modest place where travelers could resupply and trade. It wasn't heavily regulated, which might be perfect for Rowan and Aelynn'rae to slip through unnoticed. The hours passed, the desert sun blazing overhead. Aelynn'rae shielded her eyes, occasionally pointing out a formation or a strange desert creature. Rowan noticed she seemed both excited and apprehensive. Like every new sight was a revelation, but each one reminded her of how far she was from home. By late afternoon, they spotted the outpost in the distance, a cluster of low buildings built around a rocky outcrop with tall solar towers gleaming in the sun. The caravan picked up speed, eager to reach shelter and commerce. Rowan felt a mix of relief and tension. This was the first real settlement they'd encountered together. How would Aelynn'rae be received? As they rolled into the outpost, dust billowed around them. Merchants and locals bustled about, calling out wares, bartering and loading cargo. Aelynn'rae directed the walker to a stable area, where they parked and began unloading. Rowan and Aelynn'rae disembarked, feeling the stares of a few passers-by. Aelynn'rae shifted closer to Rowan, her posture guarded. Aelynn'rae gave them a nod. "Safe travels," they said simply. Rowan thanked them for their help, and they parted ways. He and Aelynn'rae guided their hover sled toward a quieter corner of the outpost, searching for a place to rest and plan their next move. They found a modest inn, the exterior made of sun-baked clay bricks. A sign outside depicted a stylized star. Rowan approached the proprietor, a stout woman with a friendly face. He rented a small room, paying with the last of his universal credits. The woman barely glanced at Aelynn'rae's features, apparently accustomed to all sorts of travelers. Rowan let out a silent sigh of relief. They entered the room, which was simple but clean: a single bed, a small table, and a window overlooking the dusty street. Aelynn'rae sat on the edge of the bed, taking in her surroundings. She looked overwhelmed. Rowan closed the door, crossing to her side. "You all right?" he asked gently. She exhaled, rubbing her arms. "It's all so new. The sounds, the smells, the people. I feel like I'm in a dream." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "We can leave as soon as we get supplies," he assured her. "Or if you want to stay longer, we can. Whatever you need." She gazed at him, eyes shining with a mix of uncertainty and gratitude. "I need you," she whispered. "I'm not sure what else I need yet." His heart clenched at the vulnerability in her voice. He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her close. She relaxed against him, burying her face in his chest. They stood like that for a long moment, letting the chaotic world outside the door fade away. Eventually, they pulled apart. Rowan cleared his throat. "I'll see if I can find a communicator to contact my superiors. Let them know I'm all right. I might be able to arrange for a discreet pickup, or at least get some information on the next ship off this planet." Aelynn'rae nodded, though she seemed hesitant. "Will they ask questions about me?" He pressed his lips together. "I'll be careful. I won't tell them about you or your tribe. I'll just say I need transport." She nodded, her trust evident. "All right." They left the room and wandered the outpost, taking in the sights. Market stalls displayed goods from across the sector: exotic fruits, handmade crafts, spare parts for vehicles. Aelynn'rae lingered by a stall selling woven tapestries, her eyes tracing the intricate designs. The merchant smiled at her, and she smiled back shyly. Rowan could tell she was fascinated by the diversity of life here, so different from her secluded home. He found a small communication station near the center of the outpost, but it was crowded. A line of travelers waiting to place calls. A tired clerk managed the station, directing people to available booths. Rowan waited his turn, feeling Aelynn'rae's hand slip into his, a gesture of reassurance. When they finally reached a booth, Rowan stepped inside and tried to place a secure call. The connection was spotty, and after a few attempts he managed to reach a corporate liaison. He spoke in vague terms, saying he was stranded and needed extraction, but left out any mention of the sacred springs or Aelynn'rae. The liaison sounded surprised to hear from him. Having assumed his mission was proceeding smoothly, they promised to send a small vessel in about 3 days, directed to land at a set of coordinates near the outpost. Rowan thanked them and ended the call. He stepped out, exhaling. "They'll be here in 3 days, he told Aelynn'rae quietly. "We can catch a ride off-world." She bit her lip, glancing around the bustling outpost. "What happens then?" He hesitated. "We'll figure it out. Maybe we can head to a colony where no one will bother us, or somewhere more remote if you prefer." She nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her eyes. "I just don't want to be property or a curiosity." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll protect you," he said, voice resolute. "No one will treat you that way." They left the station, wandering back toward the inn. On the way, they passed a group of rough-looking men. One of them eyed Aelynn'rae's ears, sneering. Rowan guided her away, ignoring their stares. He felt a flash of anger, but he knew better than to start trouble here. Once in their room, they locked the door, and Rowan let out a breath. "We should lay low until the pickup. No need to draw attention." Aelynn'rae nodded, her tension clear. "Agreed." They settled on the bed, exhaustion catching up with them. Aelynn'rae leaned against Rowan, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We're almost there," he murmured. trying to reassure them both. She sighed, resting her head on his chest, and they fell into a companionable silence. Time passed slowly in the outpost. They stayed mostly indoors, venturing out only to get food or check on the hover sled. Each evening, they returned to their small room, where they found comfort in each other's presence. They shared quiet conversations about their lives, their fears, and the possibilities of the future. Sometimes, they held each other in the darkness, letting their bodies speak a language of solace and desire. Each intimate moment strengthened the bond they'd formed in the caverns. On the second night, as they lay entwined, Aelynn'rae whispered, "I keep dreaming of my brothers, hunting us." "I can't shake the fear." Rowan brushed his fingers through her hair, trying to soothe her. "They won't find us here," he said gently, "and soon we'll be gone from this planet. Free." She snuggled closer, drawing comfort from his words. He felt her trembling subside, replaced by a slow, steady breathing as she drifted off to sleep. He stayed awake a while longer, mind churning with the weight of their situation. He remembered her initial threat, that they must bond or he'd be killed. Now they'd forged a bond that went far deeper than any forced rite, yet the danger wasn't entirely behind them. Morning dawned on the third day. Rowan and Aelynn'rae prepared for departure, gathering their meager belongings. The corporate vessel was due to land in a remote spot beyond the outpost, so they planned to take the hover sled out to meet it. As they loaded up the sled, Rowan felt a swirl of conflicting emotions, relief at leaving this perilous place, but also a pang of uncertainty about the future. Would Aelynn'rae truly be safe in the wider galaxy? They left the outpost behind, the hover sled gliding over the sands once more. Aelynn'rae sat close to Rowan, her hand resting on his thigh for balance. The sky was clear, the sun rising high, casting a bright glare over the desert. According to Rowan's coordinates, the landing zone was about an hour's ride away. Halfway there, Aelynn'rae suddenly stiffened, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Rowan," she said in a tense whisper, pointing. He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. 3 figures stood on a rocky ridge, watching them. Even from a distance, he recognized the stance, the posture. Her brothers. They'd found them. Rowan cursed under his breath, urging the sled to accelerate. The battery gauge was decent, but not infinite. The brothers descended the ridge, moving with that fluid grace he'd come to associate with Aelynn'rae's people. He saw the glint of weapons at their sides. They were too far away to engage immediately, but they'd likely track them. A chase across open desert was inevitable. Aelynn'rae's face was pale. "They'll try to kill you," she said, voice tight with dread. "And they won't forgive me for betraying the tribe." Rowan pressed a hand over hers. "We won't let them. We'll outrun them to the landing zone." He pushed the sled to its limit, the engine whining. The desert blurred around them, dunes rising and falling. In the distance, the ridge of rocks gave way to flatter terrain. The vessel's coordinates blinked on Rowan's wrist display, guiding him onward. He spared a glance behind them, and his heart lurched. The brothers were moving fast, using some sort of leaping stride that ate up distance alarmingly quickly. Aelynn'rae clenched her jaw, eyes blazing with a mix of fear and resolve. "Rowan, if they catch us, they'll show no mercy." He nodded grimly. "Then we don't let them catch us." But the terrain grew treacherous, with patches of loose sand that bogged down the sled. Each time they hit a soft patch, the sled slowed and the engine strained. The brothers gained ground. Rowan cursed, scanning for a firmer path. A rocky stretch lay to the left, but it would take them off course from the landing zone. Still, it might give them a chance to shake pursuit. He veered left, the sled jolting over stones. Aelynn'rae held on, her knuckles white. They zigzagged between boulders, dust and gravel kicking up behind them. The brothers split up, one circling around to cut them off. Rowan realized with growing alarm that these men knew how to hunt, and they weren't weighed down by a vehicle. The landing zone was still several miles away. Rowan's display beeped, indicating the corporate vessel was inbound. A wave of hope surged through him. If they could just hold out a bit longer, they could board the ship and escape. He gunned the sled, pushing it harder. The engine whined in protest, but it surged forward, clearing the rocky stretch and returning to open sand. Aelynn glanced behind them. "They're still coming," she called, her voice tight with panic. Indeed, the brothers were relentless, bounding across the desert in leaps and rolls that defied human ability. Rowan clenched his teeth, scanning the horizon. There, a glint of metal in the sky. The vessel was descending, kicking up dust in a swirl of thrusters. "Hold on!" Rowan shouted. He steered toward the landing craft, which was setting down in a flat expanse. As they neared, the ramp began to lower. He could see 2 crew members scanning the area. Relief flooded him. They just needed to reach it. Suddenly, one of the brothers sprinted ahead of the others, launching himself into the air with a powerful leap. He landed close to the sled, sand spraying. Aelynn cried out, clinging to Rowan. The brother, a lithe figure with a fierce expression, drew a blade, the steel catching the sunlight. Rowan swerved, trying to avoid him, but the brother slashed at the sled's propulsion unit. Sparks flew and the sled lurched. They lost altitude, skidding across the sand. Rowan fought to keep control, but the engine sputtered. Aelynn gasped as they tumbled off the sled, rolling in the sand. The brother advanced, blade raised. Rowan scrambled to his feet, shielding Aelynn with his body. His sidearm was still strapped to his belt, but he hesitated to draw it. Killing her brother would devastate her, yet if he didn't defend them, they were finished. Aelynn'rae appeared behind the first brother, his expression cold as stone. He barked an order, pointing at Rowan. The third brother flanked them. Aelynn pushed herself up, standing beside Rowan, chest heaving. She spoke in their language, voice pleading. Rowan couldn't understand the words, but he recognized desperation. She was begging them to spare him, to let them go. Aelynn'rae's eyes flicked to Rowan, then back to Aelynn. His lips curled in anger. He spat something that sounded like an accusation. Aelynn shook her head vehemently, tears gathering in her eyes. She spread her arms, as though shielding Rowan. Aelynn'rae's expression darkened, and he raised his hand. One of the brothers lunged for Rowan. Rowan had no choice. He ducked the strike, drawing his sidearm in a fluid motion. The brother snarled, blade flashing, but Rowan managed to fire a warning shot into the sand. A burst of dust exploded at the brother's feet, causing him to recoil. Aelynn'rae barked another order, and the third brother rushed in, forcing Rowan to dodge. He aimed again, his heart pounding with dread. If he had to, he would shoot, but he didn't want to kill them. Aelynn shouted something, stepping between Rowan and her brothers. One of them grabbed her arm, yanking her aside. She cried out, struggling. Rage surged through Rowan. He aimed at the brother's blade hand, intending to disarm him. The shot grazed the brother's wrist, causing him to drop the weapon with a pained cry. Aelynn'rae snarled, launching himself at Rowan in a blur of motion. Rowan braced for impact, but Aelynn intervened. She twisted free from the other brother's grip and tackled Aelynn'rae, knocking him off course. They tumbled in the sand, grappling. Rowan turned to face the remaining brother, who clutched his wounded wrist, eyes burning with fury. The man lunged, ignoring the pain. Rowan sidestepped, striking with the butt of his sidearm. The brother staggered, and Rowan kicked the blade away. Aelynn'rae managed to pin Aelynn momentarily, pressing a dagger to her throat. Rowan froze, heart pounding in terror. Aelynn'rae shouted at Rowan, presumably demanding surrender. Aelynn whimpered, eyes locked on Rowan's. He felt his stomach churn with dread. He lowered his sidearm, not wanting to risk her life. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, Aelynn twisted her body, dislodging Aelynn'rae's grip. She rolled away, and Rowan seized the opening, leveling his weapon at Aelynn'rae. "Stop!" he yelled, voice trembling. Aelynn'rae hesitated, blade still in hand. The other brothers circled, though one was wounded and the other disarmed. A roar of engines filled the air. The corporate vessel hovered overhead, dust swirling. The crew must have noticed the confrontation. A side hatch opened, and a voice boomed through a speaker. "Stand down. We are authorized to intervene." Aelynn'rae glared at Rowan, then at the ship. He spat a curse in his language. Aelynn scrambled to Rowan's side, breathing hard. She called out to her brothers, her voice raw. Rowan recognized a plea for peace, but Aelynn'rae's gaze was murderous. He barked an order, and the uninjured brother retrieved the wounded one. They glowered at Rowan and Aelynn with hatred. Rowan kept his sidearm raised, though his hands shook. If Aelynn'rae attacked again, Rowan would have no choice. But the thunder of the vessel's engines seemed to give the brothers pause. Aelynn'rae sneered, gesturing sharply to Aelynn, then pointing to Rowan. He spoke a final sentence, the meaning clear. "This is not over." Then in a fluid motion, Aelynn'rae and the others turned and bounded away, disappearing into the swirling dust. Rowan felt his knees go weak with relief. Aelynn sank to the sand, tears streaming down her cheeks. The vessel landed, and 2 crew members rushed over, weapons drawn, scanning the area. Rowan waved them off. "They're gone," he croaked. The crew members checked Rowan and Aelynn for injuries, then escorted them onto the ship. Once inside, the hatch sealed, and the engines powered up for takeoff. Rowan collapsed into a seat, Aelynn beside him, both of them shaking from the adrenaline. The crew gave them water and medical checks, though they asked no questions beyond the basics. It seemed the corporate liaison had ordered them not to pry. Aelynn pressed her face to Rowan's shoulder, sobbing quietly. He wrapped his arms around her, his own tears threatening to fall. They had come so close to losing everything. The reality of fighting her own kin weighed heavily on both of them. He whispered soothing words, stroking her hair, trying to comfort her as the ship rose into the sky. They remained like that for the duration of the short flight to the main orbital station. Upon arrival, they disembarked, stepping into the sterile corridors. Aylynn's eyes darted around, taking in the polished metal walls, the hum of machinery, the artificial lighting. Rowan guided her gently, shielding her from the curious stares of station personnel. He led her to a private lounge, where they could finally catch their breath. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. He knelt in front of her, resting a hand on her knee. "Aelynn," he said softly, "it's over. We're safe." She lifted her tear-streaked face. Her eyes filled with sorrow. "I fought my brothers," she whispered. "I hurt them. They'll never forgive me." He squeezed her hand. "They gave you no choice. They would have killed me. You saved my life." She let out a shaky breath, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know, but it still hurts. They're my family." Rowan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "I'm sorry," he murmured, wishing he could take away her pain. She clung to him, sobs racking her body. He stroked her hair, letting her release the torrent of grief. He knew that she had severed ties with her tribe, with everything she'd known. She had sacrificed it all for him. After a while, her sobs subsided, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. He wiped her cheeks with his thumbs. "We'll find a place where you can be free, where no one will treat you like a criminal," he said gently. "I promise." She looked at him, eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I believe you," she whispered. They spent the next few days on the station, finalizing arrangements to leave. Rowan pulled strings to keep Aylynn's presence under wraps, avoiding official scans or records that might draw attention. He falsified his report on the geothermal springs, marking them as unstable and unfit for exploitation. He hoped it would discourage further interest in her home. During their time on the station, Aelynn slowly adjusted to the new environment. She was fascinated by the viewports that looked out into the starry void, her reflection merging with the stars. Rowan took her to a quiet observation deck where they stood side by side, gazing at the expanse of space. She pressed a hand to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. "I never imagined this," she said in awe. "All those lights, each one a world, or many worlds." He nodded, sliding an arm around her waist. "And now you can see them for yourself." She turned to him, her gaze warm despite the lingering sadness. Only if you're with me. He cupped her cheek, leaning in to kiss her softly. I'm not going anywhere without you. They booked passage on a transport ship headed to a distant colony known for its tolerance of diverse cultures. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was a start, a chance to build a life together, far from the shadows of her tribe's laws and the corporation's meddling. The night before their departure, they returned to the observation deck, wanting to share a final moment of solitude before venturing into the unknown. Aelynn'rae leaned against the railing, the lights of distant stars reflecting in her opalescent eyes. Rowan stood behind her, arms encircling her waist. She tilted her head back against his shoulder, and he bent to kiss the curve of her neck. A soft sigh escaped her lips. They turned to face each other, letting the hum of the station fade into the background. Their kisses deepened, a slow exploration of trust and tenderness. They sank to the floor of the observation deck, hidden in a quiet alcove. Aelynn'rae's hair spilled over her shoulders, and Rowan ran his fingers through the sleek strands, recalling how they'd shone in the moonlit cavern. She undid the fastenings of his jacket, her touch growing bolder. The heat of desire kindled once more. He reciprocated, removing her lightweight station attire, revealing the familiar patterns on her skin. Their bodies pressed together, hearts beating in tandem, the vastness of space, a silent witness. Each touch, each caress, was a reaffirmation of the bond they'd forged in adversity. Aelynn'rae's breath hitched as Rowan trailed kisses down her collarbone, tracing the delicate frost-vein lines that still glowed faintly under her emotion. She whispered his name, and he responded by cradling her face, capturing her lips in a tender yet urgent kiss. They let the moment envelop them, the observation deck's ambient lighting casting gentle shadows across their entwined forms. Aelynn'rae guided his hands along her body, showing him the spots that made her shiver. He responded with equal devotion, sharing his own vulnerabilities and desires. When they finally joined in that intimate dance, it was with a deep sense of reverence, as though every breath, every movement, was a vow to protect and cherish each other. Their climax came softly, a wave of shared ecstasy that left them both trembling. Aelynn'rae buried her face in Rowan's neck, tears of emotion slipping down her cheeks. He held her, pressing kisses to her temple, his own eyes damp. It felt like the final consummation of their bond, no longer tainted by the threat that had first forced them together. This was a choice they made freely, united by love and hope. They dressed slowly, exchanging tender smiles. Aelynn'rae's cheeks glowed with a subtle warmth, and Rowan felt a rush of affection for this brave, curious woman who had risked everything for him. He helped her adjust her clothing, smoothing out wrinkles, then drew her into a final embrace. She rested her head on his shoulder, contentment and a hint of sadness mingling in her gaze. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She inhaled, then nodded. "I am. Let's see what the stars have to offer." They left the observation deck hand in hand, boarding the transport that would carry them away from the station, and from the planet where their paths had first crossed. As the ship departed, Rowan felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia. He thought of the hidden caverns, the sacred springs, and the confrontation with her brothers. He remembered the fear, the desperation, and ultimately the love that had blossomed against all odds. Aelynn'rae sat beside him, gazing out a small viewport. The planet's surface shrank behind them, its swirling clouds and shimmering seas becoming just another sphere in the cosmic tapestry. She reached for Rowan's hand, and he laced his fingers through hers. They exchanged a silent promise. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. By the time the ship engaged its faster-than-light drive, the planet was gone from view, replaced by the endless stars. Rowan and Aelynn'rae shared one last glance at each other, then settled back in their seats. Their journey was just beginning, but their bond was strong, forged by shared danger and deepened by genuine affection. The memory of their intimate moments in the caverns, under waterfalls, and in the station's observation deck lingered in their minds, a testament to the love that had grown between them. And though they carried scars from the battles fought, both physical and emotional, they also carried hope. Hope for a future free from persecution, free from guilt, and filled with possibilities they had only begun to imagine. As the transport sailed into the depths of space, Rowan closed his eyes, listening to Aelynn's steady breathing beside him. In that sound, he found a sense of home he had never known before. They had seen too much, too many secrets, too many dangers. But they had also seen each other's hearts laid bare in moments of vulnerability. And in that mutual understanding, they discovered the courage to stand against old laws and old fears. Together, they left the ghosts of the caverns behind, stepping into a new life bound by love and the promise of freedom. The ship's engines hummed, carrying them toward an uncertain future. Yet as Aelynn rested her head on Rowan's shoulder, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, neither felt any regret. Their bond was real, unbreakable. No matter what challenges awaited them among the stars, they would face it side by side, hearts intertwined, ready to forge their own destiny.